7/10% of the uranium is the one we want. So they brought that concentration in the first set from 7/10% up to about 10–12%. And then the material was sent to the secondary cyclotrons, where it went from 10–12% up to bone grade material, which is about 90% purity. The heart of a cyclotron, of course, are these large magnets. Normally, you would make these magnets out of copper, but at the time there was simply no copper available. The Japanese had cut off our supply. What little copper we had in the country was used for other military purposes, and for the large amount of material that would be required here, that just didn't exist. So someone came up with the idea, well, if copper works, silver is as good a conductor as copper, why not use silver? Once they found out that the U.S. government had a huge stockpile of silver. In West Point, New York, is where the government stored in bars a huge quantity of pure silver. So the head of Oak Ridge, a military fellow, a colonel named Kenneth Nichols, got on the train and went to West Point, New York, to borrow silver to make the magnets from. They knew why he was coming, to borrow silver and talk, and they were agreeable to that, although he could tell them nothing about what he was going to do with it. But when he got up there, he found out that they didn't know how much he needed. So when we asked, how much silver do you need? He said, I need 27 million pounds, which in today's market would be $7.2 billion. Well, it caused a little consternation on their part. He couldn't tell them what he was going to use it for, when he was going to return it, how much he was going to lose, or anything else. But after some further conversations with higher authorities, he was given permission to get the silver. The silver was shipped immediately to several different manufacturing sites around the country where they melted. And by the way, with that shipment went a lot of security people from the government to be sure the silver didn't get in their own pockets. So the silver was melted and formed into these large magnets and shipped to Oak Ridge, where they were assembled in the cyclotron like you see shown here. One interesting thing about this whole process, everybody, the large number of people working at Oak Ridge could readily see that what they were using as feed material was coming in on large trains. They were huge steam engines that were pulling 100 boxcars at a time. Each boxcar was loaded floor to ceiling with drums of this iron ore that had contained the uranium. Of course, the people there didn't know about the uranium. It was a big secret. But they could see at least what they had to work with. They could see a big receiving department in action. But the funny thing was, they never ever shipped anything out. It seemed like a strange business. Well, the reason they didn't is, remember, 10,000 pounds of ore makes 2/10 of a pound of material. So when they would finally, after several months, produce 5–10 pounds of the product uranium-235, it was placed in briefcases like shown here that were locked. Then the briefcase was handcuffed to a courier's wrist. He and several plainclothes security people were placed on a train along with heavily armed, and then they would make their way to Los Alamos with the product. So nobody in the rest of the place had any idea about what the product was or what was being shipped. The product itself was made in these disc forms that went in the briefcases, a little disc like this, 90% purity uranium-235. All of the uranium-235 that was used initially in the research and development at Los Alamos and development of the bomb was made by Eastman. All uranium that was used in the bomb in Hiroshima was also produced by Eastman. The carbide process, that also located at Oak Ridge, had a lot of technical problems, and so they were about a year behind Eastman in getting their plant to producing material. It turns out the Union Carbide plant was much more economical, so as soon as the war was over, they switched to the carbide process and shut down the Eastman process and shipped the silver back to West Point. But it was this tremendous change in 10,000 pounds to less than 2/10 pound that causes all the consternation.
Now, go from the factory at Oak Ridge and go back to a timeline in your mind that had to be unfolding as all this was developed. In mid-42 to 45 was when all that was happening. All right, in April 45, Roosevelt dies. The president dies, and he has been so secretive that he didn't even tell Harry Truman what was going on. And so there is a process from April of 45 through July of 45 that the scientists have to educate Truman on what was happening. He was completely in the dark, had to get his best effort to understand all that had taken place from 42 to 45, and then ultimately make the final decision of whether it was used. So this was what we call educate Truman. July 45 now, all the research was still going on, and the testing that took place of the original process occurred in Los Alamos. And it was in July of 45. And that was the day of Trinity, is what they called it. And it was the first atomic bomb explosion, and it was equivalent to 10,000 tons of TNT. And so between July, that's early July, and between late July, the Japanese were informed that this process had been completed and that it was culminating in a new instrument that was lethal, and that they were going to be the target if they didn't make some kind of conciliatory effort. There was no response. So the bomb, then they tested the process in July and notified the Japanese, and then by August the 5th, the actual bomb that was to be used was transported from Los Alamos to the Tinian Island, which is the closest air base that the B-29, which was big enough to carry this bomb, could get to Japan. And so it was called Little Boy. August the 6th, you said August the 5th was when it was there, and it no sooner got there than they picked the target. And the target was picked because it was of military significance. It had 25,000 military personnel and a lot of surrounding factories. And it was then 6 to 9, still no response from the Japanese in any way to say that they wanted to discuss the relationship any further or their war effort. August the 9th, August the 6th was bombed, and that was the first one. And then they got no response between 6 and 9, and by the 9th they had a secondary target. There were 2 bombs. And in this little aside, there were 7 planes, 7 B-29s were designated for this mission. And they were based on Tinian Island. And 3 of the planes were decoys. One of the plane had the bomb, and one had the photographic equipment, and one had the other scientific measurements. Is that right? The instruments that recorded all the measurements that they wanted. The 7th plane remained at Tinian Island because it was not needed. The others worked. But in case one didn't work, they wanted a reserve plane. All right, so then they sent the second bomb on the 9th of August, and Nagasaki was also a military target. And it was the larger bomb by that time, the plutonium bomb, and Nagasaki was, Kokura was the first choice, but the weather clouded it in, and the planes could not trust their instruments under those conditions, And so the alternative target was Nagasaki, and that was the second, and it was a military target as well. So they went to the default target, which was Nagasaki. And that was August the 9th. August the 14th, Japan surrendered. They could not use the word surrender because it was so antithetical to any of their understanding. But they said for humanitarian reasons, after seeing the carnage that had occurred, they did agree to give up their war effort. World War II ended with that, of course, and the signature was on the battleship, as you remember. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Gayle and let him tell you about the 11 Eastman employees.
I might mention, by the way, you noticed on the slide about the plutonium bomb, it was what DuPont developed. And it was made from uranium, but it was a new element that was created. We didn't get into that since our focus is on the Eastman's role involved here. There were 11 people that worked at Oak Ridge that came to work here in Longview to start up Texas Eastman. And we felt it appropriate to recognize these people and tell you a little bit about them. So in alphabetical order, I'll run through these and introduce you to them. Harry Burnson, I know a lot of you will know some of these people. Harry Burnson was a chemist that was hired directly from college to go to work for Eastman Chemical and report to Oak Ridge. And he worked in the operation of some of the chemical plants. And later in 1950 transferred to Longview and worked in manufacturing here as well, later becoming a department superintendent of a wax and adhesives plant. Waddy Burton had one of the more interesting assignments. He was a civil engineer. He was the very first employee to become part of this Manhattan Project, as it was known. He was transferred, once Eastman was designated as operator of one of the plants, he was transferred from Kingsport to Boston to work with Stone and Webster, who had the responsibility for the design and construction of the Eastman plants in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So he was the initial liaison person. From Boston, he went to Oak Ridge and did work there and later transferred in as the number one, as the first employee of Texas Eastman. He came here and began layout work where the lakes were going to be and the roads and the different plants. And later became the division superintendent of our engineering and construction area. Ben Hawk was a chemist. He worked, not as a chemist really, he worked in the materials handling area in Oak Ridge, involved in the receiving and shipping areas, and later transferred to Texas, again staying in that materials handling area, and became a supervisor here at Texas. Holly Hornbeck was working with personnel in Oak Ridge. He is the only one I ever heard talk in my 40 years at Eastman about anything at Oak Ridge until after we had retired, because he was not involved at all with any of the technical aspects of the business. He was involved in the tremendous number of people that were being hired and fired. And he had the most unusual, funny stories you can imagine with all the things that would happen with that many people from that area of the country. But he served in personnel in Oak Ridge and came in 1950 as our personnel director and had that job for several years. David Hull, I mentioned earlier, was the person that was most responsible for developing the process that became the RDX production unit, and as a 33-year-old chemist. Later, he transferred from Kingsport to Oak Ridge as a division superintendent. He was responsible for several of the operating departments in the Eastman complex. And in 1950, transferred to Texas Eastman. He was the first plant manager and as a 40-year-old employee. And for the next 25 years was the only plant manager that we had during the early development and rapid development of Texas Eastman. By the way, he has two grandsons still here, Murray and David Roberts, that some of you may know. Duncan Kieslow was involved in the purchasing department at Oak Ridge and did similar work when in 1950 he transferred and became the head of the purchasing area at Texas. Ellis Nye had an interesting background. He is the only one of the 11 that did not have a technical degree of some sort. He was actually a pipe fitter at Oak Ridge, but apparently a very good one. And he was invited to come join Texas Eastman, came and joined the maintenance area, and worked his way up to becoming a department superintendent of one of the maintenance departments supporting one of the operating areas. Ira Rathman was a civil engineer, worked in civil engineering projects at Oak Ridge and came as in our engineering department at Texas, headed up a group in engineering department in the civil engineering section. He's the father of Casey Rathman, that some of you will know. Morris Rickmeyer worked in the mechanical engineering area at Oak Ridge and transferred to 1950 to Texas. Worked in engineering as well, headed up a mechanical engineering group. He is the father of Linda Rickmeyer, who you might know as Linda Scoggins, Don Scoggins' wife. Don was one of our later presidents. Bob Schrader probably had the most interesting of all as far as the history is concerned. Bob was a graduate of Purdue University when chemical engineering was just being started. Initially he had mechanical, civil, and electrical engineering, and chemical engineering was a brand new field. So when Bob went through Purdue, he was one of the first people to go through the chem engineering program. And when he finished his degree, he received a full scholarship from Eastman Kodak to go to MIT University, the most prestigious of the engineering schools, to work on his doctoral degree. So he did that for 3 years, and when he was about a week away from graduating, Eastman supervisor contacted him and said that a couple of days he needed to go to a meeting over at Stone and Webster in Boston, where MIT and Stone and Webster headquarters were located. Said, I can't tell you anything about who's going to be there or what the purpose of it is, just show up. So he said he did, and he was stunned when he got there. He said the head of Eastman Kodak, the head of Eastman Chemical, the head of Stone and Webster, and top military people were all in this meeting. So he said he felt very honored when he was called in and congratulated on his, about to attain his doctoral degree. But they said, before you go to work for Eastman Kodak, as he had agreed to do earlier, in Rochester, New York, we want to assign you to Eastman Chemical Company for a very super secret government project. But this project is going to take place really in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where you'll need to reside. But initially, we want you to stay here in Boston and work with Stone and Webster in the design of the plants. Bob said, when I left there, my head was swimming. He said, I hadn't graduated, and I'd been transferred from Rochester to Kingsport to Oak Ridge and back to Boston. But Bob became the youngest department superintendent at Oak Ridge, and later transferred to Texas, worked his way through various assignments, primarily in the plastics area, and became the works manager, where he was responsible for all production, engineering, and construction. He has a daughter that lives here in Longview, Nancy Webb, that some of you may know. Jim Witt was the last of the 11. He was an accountant and worked in the accounting area, as you would imagine, in Oak Ridge, and later transferred to Texas and was one of the supervisors in the accounting department. Some of you may have heard or know of Jim for the fact that he was on the city council here in Longview for several years. Well, that is the group that we have of the 11 people. None of these 11 people, all of them had military exemptions because of the work they were in, so none of them were in the military. But all of them paid a big price in the work they did and made major contributions to bringing the war to an early ending. Certainly, we think of them as a major part of the greatest generation, as all of us have heard about. Well, that completes our presentation for today, and if any of you have any questions and answers, we'd certainly